Peacekeeping and conflict resolution in Africa face challenges due to the complex nature of conflicts, historical grievances, and the presence of non-state actors. Sustaining peace requires addressing root causes and fostering inclusive dialogue. Effective peacekeeping and conflict resolution in Africa often require collaboration between the United Nations, the African Union, and other international partners and regional organizations. Coordinated efforts aim to build local capacities, strengthen institutions, and promote sustainable peace. Addressing the challenges posed by protracted conflicts and long-standing disputes on the African continent has been a major focus for the UN. Missions have been deployed to conflict-affected regions with the aim of maintaining peace, facilitating political dialogue, and supporting post-conflict reconstruction. In 1960, the first peacekeeping operation in Africa was deployed in the Republic of the Congo to ensure the withdrawal of Belgian forces and to assist the government in maintaining law and order. Since then, thousands of peacekeepers have been deployed to more than 30 peacekeeping operations in African countries. The latest peacekeeping mission was established in 2014 in the Central African Republic. The UN Security Council established the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, ICTR, to prosecute persons responsible for genocide and other serious violations of international humanitarian law committed in the territory of Rwanda and neighboring states in 1994. During its operation, the tribunal indicted 93 individuals including high-ranking military and government officials, politicians, businessmen, as well as religious, militia, and media leaders. With its sister international tribunals and courts, the ICTR has played a pioneering role in the establishment of a credible international criminal justice system, producing a substantial body of jurisprudence on genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, as well as forms of individual and superior responsibility. The ICTR is the first ever international tribunal to deliver verdicts in relation to genocide, and the first to interpret the definition of genocide set forth in the 1948 Geneva Conventions. It is also the first international tribunal to define rape in international criminal law and to recognize rape as a means of perpetrating genocide, as well as the first international tribunal to hold members of the media responsible for broadcasts intended to inflame the public to commit acts of genocide. The ICTR delivered its last trial judgment in December 2012. Since then, the mechanism for international criminal tribunals has assumed responsibility for the ICTR's residual functions, including cases before the appeals chamber and the tracking and arrest of the accused who remain fugitives from justice. Today, more than 50,000 troops are deployed for UN operations in Africa, and tens of thousands more deployed for regionally led missions in countries where civil wars and insurgencies have killed civilians and threatened to destabilize surrounding regions. Many experts agree that peacekeeping missions help protect civilians and reduce some of the worst consequences of war, even as some critics say they are often deeply flawed and ineffective at creating lasting peace. Reports of sexual and other abuses by UN peacekeepers have drawn particular condemnation in recent years and prompted some reforms. Still, heated debate persists about how to make these missions more effective, such as by looking to non-UN initiatives to bring peace to conflict-stricken parts of Africa. Where are peacekeepers deployed in Africa? Roughly half of the UN peacekeeping missions operating around the world are in Africa. These include ABI, an area contested by Sudan and South Sudan, UNISFA, the Central African Republic, MINUSCA, the Democratic Republic of Congo, MONUSCO, South Sudan, UNMISS, and Western Sahara, MINURSO. Additionally, a growing number of peacekeeping or security missions under the auspices of regional blocs, such as the African Union, (O), and the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, have emerged as alternatives to traditional UN peace operations. The O and regional partners currently oversee 10 operations across 17 countries, comprising more than 70,000 personnel. The largest are the African Union Transition Mission in Somalia, ATMIS, and the Lake Chad Basin Commission Multinational Joint Task Force, MNJTF. Most recently, in 2022, 4 African-led missions launched or revised their mandates in an effort to address worsening conflicts and support transitions to peace in the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, Ethiopia, Guinea-Bissau, and Somalia. The European Union, EU, also plays a role, though its presence has dwindled due to rising tensions between African countries and former colonial powers. An EU counterinsurgency force led by France was pressured into withdrawing from Mali in 2022 after a military junta took over the Malian government, and several other efforts involving France in the Sahel have been met with hostility from the region. Who oversees peacekeeping missions? The United Nations is the preeminent body to authorize and oversee international peacekeeping missions. It generally follows 3 principles for deploying peacekeepers. Main parties to the conflict should consent, peacekeepers should remain impartial but not neutral, and peacekeepers cannot use force except in self-defense and defense of the mandate. However, UN peacekeepers have been deployed to war zones where not all the main parties have consented, such as in Mali. Earlier this year, Mali and the DRC each formally requested that UN peacekeepers leave. Withdrawal plans for both countries' operations are currently in progress. The Eastern Congo, a legacy of intervention. Under the UN Charter, the Security Council can authorize an operation with an affirmative vote of at least 9 of its 15 members and without a veto from one of the 5 permanent members, the United States, China, France, Russia, and the United Kingdom. The Security Council likewise must vote to renew peacekeeping operations when mandates are set to expire, typically each year. The O, which comprises all 55 African states, establishes peace operations when authorized by its 15-member Peace and Security Council. The Council has no permanent members. The United Nations often gets involved in African-led missions as well. In the case of the O mission in Somalia, AMISOM, the United Nations authorized the O mission and provided funding, logistics, and other support, until the Security Council authorized a reconfiguration of the mission in 2022 to establish today's ATMIS. Similarly, the 2 major ad hoc security initiatives on the continent, the MNJTF against Boko Haram and the G5 Sahel's force, were authorized by the O and won the backing of the UN Security Council, strengthening their mandates. What do peacekeepers do? Peacekeeping mandates differ depending on the scope and scale of the conflict and on the body or group overseeing the mission. The United Nations deploys peacekeeping forces to protect civilians in armed conflicts, prevent or contain fighting, stabilize post-conflict zones, help implement peace accords, and assist democratic transitions. To achieve these goals, peacekeepers participate in a variety of peacebuilding activities, including disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration of ex-combatants, landmine removal, restoration of the rule of law, protection and promotion of human rights, and electoral assistance. Experts note, however, that over the years, UN peacekeeping mandates have become stretched and the responsibilities of peacekeepers sometimes blurred. Rather than monitoring peace as agreed by conflicting parties as the UN did during the Cold War until the late 1980s, peacekeeping operations, such as MINUSMA and AMISOM, are effectively taking sides and engaging in a variety of activities, including protection of facilities and infrastructure, counterinsurgency and effective warfighting, writes the University of the Free States Theo Neethling. O missions have similarly seen shifting goals. For example, AMISOM's initial mandate, authorized by the O Peace and Security Council and UN Security Council in early 2007, focused on the protection of Somalia's transitional government. But the scope of the mission changed over time, later focusing on facilitating the transfer of security responsibilities to Somali forces while reducing the threat posed by al-Shabaab and other armed groups. The AMISOM replacement established in 2022, ATMIS, focuses on drawing down peacekeeping operations after 15 years. Though in November 2023, the mission was extended through at least June 2024. Meanwhile, the African-led peace initiatives operating outside the traditional UN framework have a wide array of mandates, such as working toward ceasefires or peace agreements, supporting elections, protecting leaders facing unrest, carrying out stabilization and counterinsurgency efforts, and combating health crises. The G5 Sahel Joint Force, seen as a supplement to MINUSMA and originally composed of forces from Burkina Faso, Chad, Mali, Mauritania, and Niger, is mandated with combating terrorism, cross-border crime, and human trafficking in Sahel. However, Mali pulled out of the initiative in the wake of its 2020 military coup, and the military governments of Burkina Faso and Niger announced in December 2023 that they would also withdraw, leaving Chad and Mauritania to consider dissolving the G5 Sahel entirely. How are they staffed and funded? As of the end of 2023, Bangladesh, Rwanda, and Nepal were the top contributors of military and police forces for UN missions in Africa. The United States, China, and Japan are the top donors to the UN Department of Peacekeeping Operations, whose budget, currently around $6.5 billion, is overseen by the UN General Assembly. By way of comparison, the U.S. defense budget was $1.5 trillion in the 2023 fiscal year. UN peacekeepers are paid by their own governments, which the United Nations reimburses, currently at a rate of roughly $1,400 per peacekeeper per month. The disconnect between those nations that send troops and those that fund missions is often a source of tension. Wealthy nations spend the most on peacekeeping, yet they send relatively few troops. Meanwhile, countries that either send troops or whose citizens are directly affected by peacekeeping missions often have less say in how they are designed and mandated. Leaders in Africa and within the United Nations have called for African forces to play a larger role in securing peace and stability on the continent, but budget constraints persist. Unlike the United Nations with its regular peacekeeping budget, the UN has to continually seek out donors such as the United Nations, the EU, and the United States to fund its missions. In 2023, more than two-thirds of the UN's budget was funded by international partners, not member states. In 2016, the UN launched a drive to increase member funding of security initiatives, but it fell far short of reaching its $400 million goal by 2020. Are peacekeeping missions considered effective? Modern peacekeeping marks 75 years of operations in 2023. The United Nations' first peacekeeping mission launched less than 3 years after the global body was established in 1945. Over the years, these missions have made some tangible gains, but experts still differ on how to measure success. An improvement of the status quo, an accomplishment of the mandate, and an end to the conflict are among the possible benchmarks. Africa is generally considered to have had mixed results with its UN operations, with a few considered more successful, such as those in the Ivory Coast, Liberia, and Sierra Leone. In Sierra Leone, a UN mission known as UNAMSIL was deployed in 1999 to help bring an end to the country's nearly decade-long civil war through the implementation of the Lomé Peace Agreement. Observers credit the success of the mission to a number of circumstances, particularly the warring parties' commitment to the peace process, a fitting mandate with sufficient resources to carry it out, including for the disarmament and reintegration of ex-combatants, and international support for the peace and accountability process. It was imperfect, but it was widely considered to have done most of what it had been established to do, says CFR's Michelle Gavin. However, if at least one party is not willing to cease hostilities, a peacekeeping mission is likely to face greater challenges, as has been the case in the Central African Republic, CAR, and the DRC. Similarly, good relations with the host state are crucial to carrying out a genuine peace process and political strategy. The MONUSCO mission in the DRC, for example, one of the largest and longest-running UN peacekeeping operations, has faced increasing scrutiny from Kinshasa over the years. The mission was initially deployed in 2010 to protect civilians and support the stabilization of the government as it clashed with rebel groups amid political instability. The ongoing conflict has displaced millions. However, the government has argued that UN troops have been reluctant to confront rebel groups, and civilians have protested what they describe as a lack of adequate protection and widespread sexual abuse by soldiers. The mission has become so unpopular that in September 2023, President Felix Tshisekedi asked for the UN to withdraw a year in advance. Eastern Congo's troubles led Kinshasa to invite further regional intervention efforts, though the conflict continues. On a broader scale, researchers have sought to assess the benefits of peacekeepers on the ground. Georgetown University's Lisa Howard, for example, has found that peacekeepers correlate with fewer civilian casualties, and that more peacekeepers, particularly more diverse peacekeepers, parallels both with fewer civilian deaths and fewer military deaths. One group of experts modeled scenarios with and without intervention and found that peacekeeping missions are ultimately a cost-effective measure whose contributions toward mitigating conflict and preventing spillover are often underestimated. Some experts argue that those who see peacekeeping as costly often do not consider the costs avoided through their operations. The U.S. Government Accountability Office reported that financially supporting UN peacekeeping would be 8 times more cost-effective for the United States than directly sending U.S. troops to a conflict zone. What are the major criticisms? UN peacekeeping missions on the continent have been criticized for a wide range of problems, including mismanagement, failure to act when civilians are under threat, rights abuses by peacekeepers, and financing troubles. But oftentimes at the core of missions' faults, experts say, are broad mandates that are difficult to implement. The topic that comes back again and again is realistic mandates, says Gavin. How realistic is it to ask MONUSCO to protect civilians in the DRC, for example, given the geography and difficulties of moving through that terrain? How sustainable can civilian protection efforts be in the absence of a productive relationship with local authorities? Peacekeepers have come under fire for failing to intervene at critical moments. A 2014 report PDF by UN internal investigators found that peacekeepers globally only responded to 1 in 5 cases in which civilians were threatened and that they failed to use force in deadly attacks. One of the most cited failures on the African continent is the United Nations' failure to prevent the 1994 Rwandan genocide despite the presence of peacekeepers on the ground. More than 800,000 Rwandans were killed in a span of 100 days. Despite some reforms in recent years, failures to protect civilians continue, The Economist reported, in large part due to restrictions by troop-contributing countries on how their peacekeepers can be used. Additionally, a 2021 internal evaluation found that peacekeeping staff perceive the level of ethics and integrity to be low and that accountability for misconduct is low. Peacekeeping forces have also been accused of committing human rights abuses, including pervasive allegations of sexual abuse and exploitation. The United Nations disciplined several MONUSCO soldiers over allegations of sexual exploitation and violence in 2023. 2 years earlier, the United Nations withdrew hundreds of Gabonese peacekeepers from CAR and opened a probe following allegations of sexual abuse of girls. Though UN investigations into such allegations have increased in recent years, very few lead to prosecutions and none has resulted in a public conviction. UN peacekeepers have immunity from prosecution in the countries where they are deployed, leaving their home countries to undertake legal action. A newly approved Kenya-led peace mission to mitigate gang violence in Haiti has raised concerns even before being deployed due to a history of abuse within Kenya's police force. Other critics argue that peacekeeping missions are too costly given their mixed success, and that they are too reliant on funding from a few major donors. The Donald Trump administration reinstated a cap on annual U.S. contributions to UN peacekeeping and sought additional, massive cuts to major operations in Africa. President Joe Biden has reversed those cuts and agreed to pay the $1 billion the United States owed in peacekeeping debt. Meanwhile, China has boosted its support in recent years, including by launching a 10-year, $1 billion fund for peacekeeping operations. Still others point out that the veto power of the Security Council's permanent members can delay or weaken peacekeeping mandates, such as in Sudan's Darfur region. What are the prospects for reform? Some reforms are underway at the United Nations. In 2018, UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres launched the Action for Peacekeeping, A4P, initiative, which focuses on developing more targeted peacekeeping mandates with clear political strategies, improving the safety of peacekeepers as well as civilians in mission areas, and better training troops. In tandem, the Security Council unanimously adopted a resolution aimed at improving leadership and accountability in peacekeeping, in response to the reports of sexual exploitation and abuse by peacekeepers. However, it remains to be seen whether A4P is translating into concrete change. Meanwhile, experts note that the COVID-19 pandemic has increased the urgency to undertake the kind of reforms outlined in A4P. Given the proliferation of ad hoc initiatives, the Institute for Security Studies Gustavo de Carvalho argues, the United Nations should more closely coordinate with the UN regional blocs to complement one another and avoid unnecessary overlap in their missions. With African personnel increasingly filling the demand for peacekeepers, Nadine Anschorg and Felix Haas of the German Institute for Global and Area Studies stress the importance of countries with advanced militaries helping to train and equip troops. Other experts see promise in supporting additional regional-led missions, believing them to be more adaptable. At a UN Security Council meeting on peace in Africa in May 2023, Secretary-General Guterres called for a new generation of OLED operations financed by UN member nations, a model that African leaders have increasingly advocated for. Other analysts encourage inclusivity. Former CFR fellows Jamil Bijo and Rachel Vogelstein have advocated for more women peacekeepers, whose participation has been shown to improve missions' effectiveness. Moreover, many experts urge major powers to do more than bankroll missions. Victoria K. Holt of the Stimson Center and Jake Sherman of the International Peace Institute argue that the Biden administration should use the United States' permanent seat on the Security Council to ensure that missions are tailored to their environments, guided by clear, inclusive political strategies, and take into account challenges such as climate risks. As UN peacekeeping missions in Africa give way to regionally led peace operations, efforts will be needed to strengthen the operational legitimacy of African initiatives. The end of two of the United Nations' longest peacekeeping missions, in Mali and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, DRC, arguably represents a turning point for UN peacekeeping in Africa. It comes amid a decline in UN peacekeeping in favor of regionally led initiatives, a shift that has been well underway for nearly a decade. But as regional peacekeeping operations consolidate their role on the continent, greater efforts will be needed to increase their financial independence and operational legitimacy. The closure of the two missions echoes broader trends confronting UN missions as they face increased anti-Western sentiment and domestic discontent. In June 2023, Mali's military junta requested that the UN Multidimensional Integrated Stabilization Mission in Mali, known as MINUSMA, swiftly pull out amid regional escalation of violence in Western Africa's Sahelian countries. This decision was part of Bamako's new anti-Western course that included the end of military support by France and the deployment of Russia's Wagner Group. Deployed since 2013, MINUSMA's withdrawal was then completed by December 2023. Similarly, the DRC opted to terminate the UN Organization Stabilization Mission, known as MONUSCO, which has been operational in the east of the country for over 2 decades, by the end of 2024. MONUSCO has faced public criticism in the DRC for its limited success in reining in non-state armed groups, ensuring civilians' protection and achieving lasting peace. Since 2016, UN peacekeeping missions in Africa have steadily declined in number and size, in terms of budgets and the number of personnel deployed, and are projected to plummet once MONUSCO withdraws, see Figure 1. With the closing of MINUSMA and MONUSCO, there are only 4 operations left on the continent, in the Central African Republic, South Sudan, the disputed Abyei region and Western Sahara. A decade ago there were more than twice as many, and no new UN peacekeeping missions have started on the continent since then. In parallel, African-led peace support operations, PSOs, as local peacekeeping is known in the region, have grown in number and scope under the aegis of the African Union's 2002 African Peace and Security Architecture, APSA. The 1994 genocide in Rwanda first catalyzed greater African ownership of peacekeeping missions. Later, the formation of the in 2002 responded to the need to shift from a non-interference to a non-indifference approach with respect to threats to peace and security, among other considerations. There are three broad types of African PSOs. Firstly, those directly mandated and led by the like the ATMIS mission in Somalia. Secondly, PSOs initiated by regional economic communities, RECs, such as the West African Bloc ECOWAS. Thirdly, ad hoc coalitions can be formed by states sharing a security threat, as in the case of the multinational Joint Task Force in the Lake Chad region. Compared to UN peacekeeping, African PSOs deploy in a wider variety of contexts. In addition to peace and security operations, there have been missions to fight epidemics such as Ebola, to support election processes and to curb domestic unrest. Since 2000, 38 African-led PSOs have taken place, with 10 active PSOs operating throughout 17 countries on the continent in 2023. In 2022 alone, 4 new operations were either authorized, mandated or launched by the The gradual shift over the last decade towards peacekeeping operations led by regional actors has come at the same time as profound changes to armed conflicts in Africa. Escalation in the levels of violence, the rise of jihadist groups and the proliferation of non-state armed groups with diverse motives, capabilities, and reach have all taken place amid an increasing disregard for international humanitarian law and the weakening of conflict resolution mechanisms. As a result, Africa's armed conflicts have become increasingly fragmented and protracted. Amid escalating geopolitical tension and internal divisions within the UN Security Council, the body which authorizes peacekeeping missions, the rising influence of non-Western states and private military and security companies signals a seismic shift from traditional Western-centric approaches. This trend is underscored by the diminishing legitimacy of UN peacekeeping in Africa, which is now largely perceived as a Western-influenced tool bound to limited UNSC-sanctioned mandates. The closure of MINUSMA and MONUSCO will force a strategic reassessment of UN peacekeeping. At the close of 2023, the two missions combined consumed 35% of the annual $6.45 billion UN peacekeeping budget and one-third of the UN's global uniformed peacekeeping personnel. As conflicts become more protracted and intractable, hard thinking is needed on the scope, overly ambitious mandates and undefined time frames of several missions. To stay relevant, UN peacekeeping will also need to navigate and adapt to a geopolitically fragmented world. The current geopolitical fragmentation means African peacekeeping initiatives are likely to increase in number in the near future. However, concerns loom over the ability of regional forces to fill a potential security vacuum left by the UN, not only in terms of their capacity to protect human rights but also whether they will be able to safeguard regional economic interests, particularly in mineral-rich areas that are crucial to global supply chains and could be jeopardized by a resurgence of armed conflicts. In terms of their scope, African-led PSOs deploy only military personnel, compared to UN peacekeeping missions which are multidimensional and often include civilian staff tasked with peacebuilding goals. PSOs operate with more lax rules of engagement, which in practice means they become a conflict party rather than an impartial force. Moreover, they deploy in conjunction with national forces. For African-led PSOs to fully supplant the UN in the provision of regional peace and security, institutional reforms are needed at the level to define REX mandates and improve the PSO's legitimacy. This process should include the articulation of a shared vision of peace and stability on the continent so that African peacekeeping does not continue to act as a security support to incumbent governments against threats from insurgencies or violent extremism. Finally, African-led PSOs' autonomy and independence will remain constrained as long as the bulk of their funding continues to come from the UN and external donors. While the recent UN Security Council Resolution 2719, 2023, advances the UN partnership for peacekeeping operations, financial dependency reduces regional PSOs' discretion over mission timelines, scope, and mandates. In the longer term, this risks impeding the development of regional conflict resolution approaches and autonomous diplomatic processes on the continent. Somalia, Mali, and the DRC face significant security vacuums, which will undermine safety and worsen humanitarian conditions. Peacekeeping operations have played a crucial role in stabilizing fragile situations across Africa for over 60 years. More than 13 United Nations, UN, led missions in Africa and about 27 African-led peace support operations since 2000 have incurred billions of dollars annually and cost thousands of peacekeepers' lives. While these missions haven't met all their host countries' expectations, they have helped prevent state collapse, notably in Somalia, Mali, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, DRC. But are peacekeeping missions fulfilling their mandates? In Mali, persistent insecurity and the demands of the 2020 coup leaders led to the withdrawal of UN peacekeepers. Continuing violence in eastern DRC, despite the UN Organization Stabilization Mission in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, MONUSCO, being in the country for over 20 years, fueled similar calls. Funding challenges and a political standoff informed the push to end the African Union, transition mission in Somalia, ATMIS. In all three countries, calls for withdrawals have been driven by local and international political pressures, unmet domestic expectations for improved security and donor funding fatigue. This raises questions not only about peacekeeping in Africa, but the effectiveness of the global peacekeeping architecture and how public perceptions regarding its role are managed. The withdrawal of peacekeepers raises vital questions about the future of Africa's security management. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres' recent report on the overall performance of UN peacekeeping operations acknowledged these questions. It asked whether the missions were fit for purpose and why there was a gap between their mandates and what they deliver. The implications of withdrawing peacekeepers raise vital questions about the future of security management in Africa. Does the continent have the capacity to fill the inevitable security vacuum? Current developments, particularly in Somalia, Mali, and the DRC, suggest that removing peacekeepers would create a significant security gap, leading to more violence and worsening humanitarian conditions. Since the UN Multidimensional Integrated Stabilization Mission in Mali, MINUSMA, withdrawal began last July, insecurity has surged. Conflict between militants and the National Army has reignited, and militant attacks have increased. Mali's fragile security situation could regress to 2012 levels when jihadists tried to seize several key towns, including Timbuktu. Violent clashes are also rising in eastern DRC. Over 600 people died in attacks by armed groups between April and June 2023. In addition to MONUSCO and the SADC Force Intervention Brigade, the East African Community military deployment in 2022 hasn't resolved the situation. In Somalia, Al-Shabaab has intensified its terror campaign against civilians, government, and peacekeepers since ATMIS began its drawdown in June 2023. Recent incidents include a devastating truck bomb in Beledweyne, resulting in 18 deaths, suicide bomb attacks in Mogadishu that killed at least 7 civilians, and an ambush on Ethiopian troops. The Peace and Security Council recently raised concerns about Al-Shabaab's potential to exploit security gaps following ATMIS withdrawal. It was also worried about the premature downsizing and shutdown of peace support operations, due to financial constraints, and the closure of several UN peacekeeping operations. Commission Chairperson Moussa Faki Mahamat recently underscored this point, referring to the twin attacks on a military base and a passenger boat in Mali while MINUSMA was leaving the country. He said the situation highlighted the need for comprehensive, sustainable solutions to prevent violence in the Sahel from merging with Lake Chad region clashes or expanding further into West Africa. Worsening insecurity after peacekeepers depart shows the need for circumspection in demands for troops to leave. There is also an urgent need to develop robust alternatives to fill the resulting security vacuum. Thus far, national and regional efforts have not matched the severity of the threats following the peacekeepers' withdrawal. Political rather than security considerations have influenced calls for the withdrawal of peace missions. The current surge in domestic military operations in Somalia, deployment of regional forces like the East African Community in DRC, and use of entities like Wagner in Mali have been inadequate. And despite nearly 2 decades of investments, the OAS still hasn't used the African standby force for various reasons, including the lack of political will to deploy. And even if troops were mobilized, funding issues would hinder their swift deployment and sustainability. The inability to manage consequences shows that political, rather than security, considerations influenced calls for peace missions to be withdrawn. The timing of these departures highlights a new security reality in which non-state actors continue their attacks while responses remain insufficient. Sober reflections are needed. First, the UN dialogue on peacekeeping should acknowledge that Africa requires more capacity to fill the security gap following drawdowns. Calls by some African leaders and communities for peacekeepers to leave shouldn't lead to international disengagement from those situations or abandoning Africa to fend for itself. Innovative continental and regional approaches must be considered. A UN Security Council framework resolution to guide the UN's funding of peace support operations through unassessed contributions is also urgent. Second, now is the time for frank and open discussions between the UN and OAS, as called for by the new Agenda for Peace and Guterres's recent UN peacekeeping report. The OAS must urgently review and enhance its African peace and security architecture framework to prepare the African standby force to fill the security gap. And the UN dialogue should go beyond financing peace missions to include revisiting the military-heavy approach to peacekeeping. Thank you for watching this video.